Power and money can blind you to the collateral damage you leave behind. Vivian Mercer bulldozed a struggling single father's livelihood just to build another glass skyscraper. She thought it was simply corporate business. She didn't know her ruthless signature was a literal death sentence for a 6-year-old girl. Vivian Mercer did not become the CEO of Mercer Global Properties by dealing in sentiments. At 32, she was an apex predator in Chicago's cutthroat real estate market. Her world was constructed of steel glass and profit margins. She wore bespoke Italian suits like armor and viewed human emotion as a severe liability. If a property stood in the way of her vision, it was eliminated. There were no exceptions. Her current vision was the Apollo Tower, a massive 70-story luxury high-rise intended to dominate the downtown skyline. It was a billion-dollar project, fully funded, aggressively zoned, and completely stalled. The obstacle was a single 3,000-square-foot plot of land situated dead center in the proposed development footprint. On that plot sat an aging brick building that housed Wright's Haven, a community center and specialized pediatric supply shop. He rejected the $5 million offer Richard Hastings, Vivian's executive vice president, announced during their Monday morning briefing. He slid a perfectly bound dossier across the mahogany conference table. Thomas Wright, 34 years old. Widower. He owns the property outright, though he is heavily leveraged on the business side. He won't budge, Vivian. Not for $5 million, not for 10. He says the location is non-negotiable. Vivian picked up the dossier, her manicured fingers flipping through the pages of Thomas Wright's life. Everyone has a price, Richard. If he won't take our money, we take his options. Who holds the commercial debt for his supply shop? Richard hesitated, knowing Vivian's tactics were about to turn legally brutal. Harrison and Cole Financial. He owes them roughly $400,000. He's been making minimum payments for 2 years. Buy the debt, Vivian ordered, not looking up from the file. Pay Harrison and Cole a 20% premium for the immediate transfer of the paper. Once we hold the note audit, his financials for any breach of covenant. I guarantee a mom-and-pop shop like this has violated a liquidity clause. When you find it, call in the loan immediately. He'll have 30 days to produce $400,000 in cash, or we seize the collateral, which is the building. We'll foreclose and have him out by the end of the month. Vivian, that's aggressive. The press might spin it as a corporate giant, crushing a single dad. Let them spin, Vivian replied, coldly snapping the folder shut. I am building a legacy, Richard. I am not running a charity. Within exactly 14 days, the trap was sprung. Mercer Global Properties legally acquired the debt, triggered the technical default clause, and served Thomas Wright with an immediate demand for payment. Unable to produce the cash, Thomas's property was pushed into an expedited foreclosure process. A legal loophole Mercer Global had spent millions lobbying the city to create for blighted urban areas. 3 days later, Vivian's assistant, Chloe Davenport, buzzed her intercom. Ms. Mercer, there is a man in the lobby. He circumvented security. He's demanding to speak with you. It's Thomas Wright. Vivian sighed, setting down her Mont Blanc pen. Send him up. Let's get this over with. When the heavy oak doors of her office swung open, Vivian braced herself for screaming for threats, for the typical vitriol she faced from displaced tenants. Instead, the man who walked in simply looked utterly broken. Thomas Wright was tall, with broad shoulders that were currently slumped under an invisible crushing weight. He wore a faded flannel shirt and work boots. There were deep bruised bags under his hazel eyes, and his hands trembled slightly as he clutched a thick manila folder. Mr. Wright, Vivian said, her voice a cool, practiced monotone. I assume you are here about the foreclosure. My legal team has already explained the situation. I don't care about the money, Thomas said, his voice thick with a desperate kind of exhaustion. He walked closer to her desk, but kept a respectful distance. Keep the 5 million. Keep the 10 million. I just need time. I need 6 more months in that building. Just 6 months. After that, you can have the deed for free. Vivian narrowed her eyes. Time is the one thing I cannot afford, Mr. Wright. The Apollo project is bleeding $100,000 a day in delays. You defaulted on your loan. The law is entirely on my side. You engineered the default. Thomas's voice cracked, a sudden flare of anger breaking through his despair. You bought my debt specifically to ruin me. He slammed his hands down on the edge of her glass desk. You don't understand what you're destroying. It's not just a shop. It's my daughter. Lily, I need the shop to stay open right there, on that exact block for 6 more months. Her life depends on it. Vivian crossed her arms, her expression hardening. She had heard every excuse in the book. Mr. Wright, everyone has a sick relative when the bulldozers arrive. I sympathize with your family situation, truly I do. But Mercer Global cannot pause a billion-dollar development for one child. The foreclosure stands. You have until Friday to vacate the premises. Thomas stared at her, his eyes searching hers for a shred of humanity. He found nothing but a polished, icy void. You are completely empty inside, he whispered softly. The fight seemed to entirely drain out of him. He picked up his folder, turned on his heel, and walked out of the office. Vivian ignored the strange, sharp pang in her chest. She picked up her pen and went back to work. Friday arrived with the bleak, biting wind, typical of Chicago in November. Vivian stood safely behind a chain-link fence, a hard hat resting on her perfectly styled hair, flanked by Richard Hastings and the city zoning commissioner, Jonathan Carmichael. Across the street, the wrecking ball swung in a slow, devastating arc, smashing through the brick facade of Wright's Haven. Dust plumed into the grey sky, carrying with it the remnants of Thomas Wright's livelihood. Out of the corner of her eye, Vivian spotted him. Thomas was standing on the opposite corner, completely still. Clinging to his leg was a small girl, no older than 6. Lily. The child was alarmingly pale, wearing a thick winter coat and a specialized hospital-grade respiratory mask over her nose and mouth. Thomas had his hands clamped over her ears to muffle the sound of the destruction. He wasn't looking at the building. He was looking directly across the intersection, right at Vivian. The absolute devastation in his eyes made Vivian physically recoil. She turned her back on the demolition, suddenly feeling a wave of nausea. It's just business, she repeated her personal mantra. It's just business. But business was about to become deeply, uncomfortably personal. 2 weeks after the demolition, the foundation work for the Apollo Tower hit a snag. Environmental inspectors had found an old reinforced sub-basement under the Wright property that hadn't been cleared. Workers had pulled several heavy metal lock boxes from the debris. Standard procedure dictated that any personal effects be catalogued and returned to the previous owner. But Thomas Wright had seemingly vanished off the face of the earth. His phone was disconnected, and his forwarding address was a dead end. Seeking to avoid any legal liabilities regarding stolen property, Vivian instructed Chloe to bring the boxes to her office so she could find a clue to Thomas's whereabouts. Late on a Tuesday evening alone, in the silence of her sprawling office, Vivian pried open the largest metal box. She expected to find tax returns, old ledgers, perhaps petty cash. Instead, she found a meticulously organized medical archive. Thick binders were stacked neatly inside, each labeled with dates and medical codes. Confused, Vivian opened the first binder. It was filled with letters from Dr. Nathaniel Brighton, the chief of pediatric immunology, at Northwestern Memorial Hospital. As Vivian read the documents, the temperature in the room seemed to drop by 10 degrees. Lily Wright had severe combined immunodeficiency, SCID, an incredibly rare genetic disorder that left her with virtually no immune system. A simple common cold was a lethal threat. But that wasn't the secret that stopped Vivian's heart. The secret was the funding. Thomas hadn't been holding out for Mercer Global's millions. He literally couldn't accept the money or move the shop. According to the heavily notarized documents, Lily was part of a highly experimental, multi-million-dollar gene therapy trial that was strictly subsidized by an archaic, highly specific state grant. The grant was intrinsically tied to the historical community impact of the physical property where Wright's Haven stood. Through an incredibly complex legal loophole drafted years ago by a local philanthropist, the state covered the staggering $40,000 a month cost of Lily's hospital treatments, but only as long as Thomas Wright maintained a functional community health center on that specific exact plot of land in downtown Chicago. If the center closed, or if the land was rezoned, the grant immediately dissolved. Vivian's hands began to shake as she read the final document in the box. It was a copy of the letter Thomas had tried to hand her in her office. It was from the State Department of Health. Please be advised that upon the foreclosure and subsequent rezoning of the property, located at 402 West Elm Street, the state subsidy providing medical coverage for Lily Wright's gene therapy trial will be terminated immediately. The patient requires exactly 6 more months of continuous treatment to achieve immune system stabilization. Interruption of this trial will result in catastrophic immune failure. Oh my God, Vivian whispered, the paper fluttering from her trembling fingers to the floor. She hadn't just destroyed a man's business. She had cut off a little girl's life support. Thomas hadn't wanted her money because millions in cash wouldn't legally replace the specific state-mandated insurance required to keep Lily in the trial. He just needed the building to stand for 6 more months to save his daughter's life. Panic, a completely foreign emotion to Vivian Mercer, seized her throat. She grabbed her phone and dialed Richard Hastings. He answered groggily. "Richard!" Vivian commanded, her voice cracking. "Find Thomas Wright. Tonight. Call private investigators. Call the police. Call hospitals. I don't care what it costs. Find him." "Vivian, it's midnight. What's going on? Just find him!" She screamed, slamming the phone down. For the next 48 hours, Vivian barely slept. The Ice Queen of Chicago real estate had finally shattered. She personally called Northwestern Memorial Hospital, demanding to speak with Dr. Nathaniel Brighton. "Ms. Mercer." Dr. Brighton's voice dripped with raw contempt when he finally took her call. "I know exactly who you are. The hospital's legal team has been dealing with the fallout of your little real estate venture for 2 weeks. Doctor, please." Vivian pleaded a tone she had never used in her professional life. "I didn't know about the grant. I didn't know about Lily's trial. I want to write a check. I will cover the $40,000 a month. I'll cover the entire trial. Just tell me where they are." "You can't just write a check to fix this, Ms. Mercer," Dr. Brighton snapped. "This is an FDA-regulated trial. It requires continuous state-approved insurance coverage. When you bulldozed that building, Lily was legally disqualified. The trial protocols are completely rigid. She was discharged." Vivian felt the air leave her lungs. "Discharged, where did they go?" "I don't know," the doctor replied heavily. "Thomas was ruined financially by the foreclosure. He lost everything. Last I heard, they were living out of his car. For a child with SCID, living in a vehicle without a sterile filtration system. Ms. Mercer, you didn't just evict a tenant. You practically handed that little girl a death sentence." The line clicked dead. Vivian sat in her pristine, silent office, the weight of her ambition finally crushing her. She looked out the floor-to-ceiling windows at the glittering Chicago skyline she had conquered, realizing for the first time that her empire was built on a foundation of shattered lives. And somewhere out there, in the freezing city, Thomas Wright was watching his daughter slip away entirely because of her. Sleep became a foreign concept to Vivian Mercer. The woman who previously required a strict 8 hours of rest to dominate boardrooms now spent her nights pacing the hardwood floors of her penthouse, fueled by black coffee and gnawing acidic guilt. Her sprawling corporate empire felt entirely useless against the terrifying reality that she had effectively banished a severely immunocompromised child into the freezing Chicago winter. Vivian transformed her executive suite into a frantic war room. She suspended all meetings regarding the Apollo Tower, much to the loud, aggressive dismay of her board of directors. She hired 4 different private investigation firms, providing them with unlimited expense accounts. She utilized her extensive political connections to quietly access traffic camera feeds, toll booth logs, and municipal parking databases. She was burning through millions of dollars a day in delays and investigative fees, but for the first time in her 32 years, the money meant absolutely nothing. "Vivian, this is professional suicide," Richard Hastings warned her on the 3rd morning of the search. He stood in the doorway of her office, watching her pin another map to a corkboard. "The board is convening an emergency session. You skipped the zoning commission meeting. The press is starting to ask why our flagship demolition site is completely abandoned. You need to let the police handle this missing persons issue and get back to being a CEO." Vivian turned slowly, her eyes bloodshot, and her typically flawless hair pulled into a messy knot. "Richard, if you mention the board, the press, or the Apollo Tower to me one more time, I will personally see to it that you never work in commercial real estate again." "Get out of my office," Richard scoffed, shaking his head. "You're losing your mind over collateral damage." "Get out!" she screamed, hurling a heavy crystal paperweight. It shattered against the doorframe inches from his head. Richard fled, and Vivian collapsed into her chair, burying her face in her hands. By the 5th day, a severe winter storm warning was issued for the greater Midwest. Temperatures were slated to drop to 10 degrees below zero. Vivian knew that a child with severe combined immunodeficiency living in a vehicle wouldn't just succumb to an infection, she would freeze to death first. At 11:42 p.m., her private cell phone rang. It was Michael Callahan, the lead investigator from the boutique firm she had retained. "Ms. Mercer," Callahan said, his voice crackling over the wind, "I've got a hit. A 2018 Ford Explorer registered to Thomas Wright. It's parked behind an abandoned strip mall on the outskirts of Gary, Indiana. He's backed it up against a loading dock to block the wind." "Are they inside?" Vivian demanded, her heart hammering against her ribs. "The windows are heavily frosted over, but there's a faint heat signature on our thermal camera. Someone is in there. I'm calling local EMS." "No," Vivian interrupted. "Local EMS will take her to a standard county ER. It's a biological nightmare in there during flu season. Lily has no immune system. A public waiting room will kill her. Send me your exact GPS coordinates. Do not approach the vehicle until I arrive." Vivian didn't bother grabbing a coat. She sprinted to the private elevator, dialing her aviation director. Within 20 minutes, Vivian was strapped into the leather seat of her corporate Sikorsky helicopter, the deafening roar of the rotors masking her ragged breathing as they tore through the stormy night sky toward Indiana. The helicopter touched down in the center of the snow-covered abandoned parking lot, illuminating the desolate area with blinding searchlights. Vivian unbuckled her harness and leaped out into the freezing maelstrom before the skids had even settled. She ran through the deep snow toward the loading dock, slipping and falling to her knees, staining her designer trousers with black slush. Callahan and his team were standing back, shining flashlights on the frost-covered Ford Explorer. Vivian approached the driver's side window and wiped away the ice with her bare, trembling hands. Inside the scene shattered whatever remained of her icy exterior. Thomas Wright was huddled in the front seat, shivering violently, wearing no coat. He had draped every piece of clothing and blanket he owned over a makeshift quarantine tent, fashioned out of thick painter's plastic and duct tape in the back seat. Vivian yanked the door handle. It was locked. She pounded on the glass. "Thomas!" Thomas opened the door. Thomas jolted awake. When his exhausted, hollow eyes met hers, a look of pure, unadulterated terror and rage washed over his face. He grabbed a heavy metal tire iron from the passenger seat and rolled down the window just an inch. "Get away from us!" Thomas rasped, his voice raw and broken. "Haven't you done enough? Are you here to tow the car too?" "Thomas, please, you have to let me help." Vivian begged, tears streaming down her face, freezing onto her cheeks. "I brought a medevac chopper. It's equipped with a positive pressure sterile isolation pod. We can get Lily out of here safely." "She's burning up." Thomas sobbed, the fight suddenly draining from him. He dropped the tire iron, his hands shaking violently. "Her fever is 104. She won't wake up. I tried to keep the car running for heat, but I ran out of gas 4 hours ago. I killed her. I failed her." "You didn't fail her, I did," Vivian said fiercely. "Unlock the door, Thomas. Let me save her." The extraction was a blur of high-stakes medical precision. Vivian's private medical team enveloped Lily in a portable, sterile isolation unit, rushing the unconscious, dangerously pale child into the waiting helicopter. Thomas, suffering from mild hypothermia himself, sat numbly beside Vivian as the chopper raced back toward Chicago. Vivian had completely bypassed the public hospital system. Over the last 48 hours, anticipating this exact scenario, she had utilized her immense wealth to quietly purchase a failing privately owned boutique surgery center in the Chicago suburbs. She had fired the existing administrative staff, hired a team of top-tier immunologists at triple their normal salary, and essentially built a fully sanitized, custom-made fortress for Lily Wright. For 3 agonizing weeks, Lily fought a massive systemic infection. Dr. Nathaniel Brighton, whom Vivian had personally flown in via private jet on a daily basis to oversee the case, managed to stabilize the little girl. However, a dark cloud still hung over them. She survived the infection. Ms. Mercer, Dr. Brighton, explained quietly in the hallway of the sterile wing. But her immune system is still a blank slate. The FDA trial was her only hope for a permanent cure, and the state board is absolutely rigid. Without the specific community grant tied to that downtown property, they refuse to readmit her into the experimental protocol. The trial medication costs millions to manufacture, and they legally cannot distribute it without that specific state funding channel. Vivian looked through the observation glass. Thomas was sitting beside his daughter's bed, reading her a story through a heavy respirator mask. The immense love radiating from the exhausted father cracked something wide open inside Vivian's chest. She realized with startling clarity that she would burn her entire billion-dollar company to the ground to see that little girl smile again. "Then we reinstate the grant," Vivian declared, her eyes narrowing with familiar, ruthless determination. But this time it wasn't for profit. It was for redemption. She marched into the boardroom of Mercer Global Properties the very next morning. The board members were furious, ready to demand her resignation for abandoning the Apollo Tower project. "The Apollo Tower design is being radically altered," Vivian announced, dropping a massive set of revised blueprints onto the mahogany table. We are halting all deep foundation work immediately. We are dedicating the entire first 3 floors of the skyscraper to a state-of-the-art, fully subsidized community health center and pediatric immunology clinic. It will operate completely free of charge for the underprivileged. The room erupted in shouts of protest. Richard Hastings slammed his hand on the table. "Vivian, you are completely out of your mind. This will cost us hundreds of millions in luxury retail space. You cannot legally do this. The zoning permits." "I have already repurchased the zoning permits and had the property legally reclassified as a philanthropic healthcare site." Vivian interrupted, her voice echoing like a gunshot. "Furthermore, I am legally deeding the first 3 floors of the building back to Thomas Wright. Wright's Haven will sit on the exact same geographic footprint it occupied before the demolition." She turned her icy, furious gaze directly onto Richard. "Which brings me to my next piece of business. Sit down, Richard." Richard sneered. "I think the board has heard enough of your emotional breakdown, Vivian. It's time for a vote of no confidence." "Before the board votes, they might want to look at the folders I just placed at their seats," Vivian said smoothly. Hesitantly, the board members opened the heavy files. Inside were copies of encrypted emails, deep-dive forensic accounting logs, and internal memos. While my legal team was untangling the mess of the state grant loophole, they found an interesting digital trail. Vivian explained, pacing the length of the table. 3 weeks before I ordered the foreclosure on Mr. Wright, Richard received the preliminary environmental report on the property. That report clearly outlined the state medical grant, Lily's condition, and the legal requirement that the building remain standing. Gasps rippled around the boardroom. Richard went completely pale, his bravado evaporating in an instant. "Richard knew," Vivian continued, her voice trembling with cold fury. "He knew that if we foreclosed, a child would lose her life-saving treatment. He buried the report. He fast-tracked the debt acquisition. He wanted me to bulldoze that building completely blind. Why? Because he knew that when the press inevitably found out a billionaire, CEO, murdered a sick little girl for a skyscraper, the board would force me out in a massive PR scandal, leaving the CEO chair wide open for him." Vivian walked over to Richard, leaning down so they were eye to eye. "You played a game of corporate chess, Richard, but you used a 6-year-old's life as a pawn. Security is waiting in the lobby with agents from the FBI's corporate fraud division. You are entirely, completely ruined." As Richard was escorted out of the building in handcuffs, a heavy silence fell over the room. The board members, staring at the evidence of Hastings' monstrous betrayal, unanimously approved Vivian's new blueprints. 10 months later, the Apollo Tower was rising into the Chicago skyline, but its foundation was fundamentally different. The entire ground floor was a beautiful sunlit community center, legally registered and deeded to Thomas Wright. Because the original physical plot was once again serving its philanthropic purpose, the archaic legal loophole was satisfied. The state reinstated the massive medical grant. Lily Wright was re-enrolled in the FDA gene therapy trial. On a warm September afternoon, Vivian stood in the courtyard of the newly opened Wright's Haven. She wasn't wearing a bespoke power suit. She wore comfortable jeans and a simple blouse. She watched as Lily, now possessing a stabilizing immune system, ran freely through the grass, laughing loudly as she chased a butterfly. Thomas walked up beside Vivian, handing her a cup of coffee. The deep, bruised exhaustion had faded from his face, replaced by a profound, radiant peace. "She starts regular kindergarten next week," Thomas said softly, his arm brushing against Vivian's. "No masks, no isolation tents." Vivian smiled, a genuine warm expression that still felt relatively new to her face. "She's a fighter, Thomas, just like her father." Thomas turned to look at her, his hazel eyes locking onto hers. The initial hatred and fear he had felt for this woman felt like a distant, impossible memory. He had seen the absolute ferocity with which she had fought the medical board, her own company, and the legal system to save his daughter. He reached out gently, taking her hand in his. "She had a pretty, incredible guardian angel, too," Thomas whispered. Vivian Mercer squeezed his hand back, resting her head against his shoulder. She had lost millions of dollars, altered her company's entire trajectory, and surrendered her reputation as Chicago's most ruthless billionaire. But as she stood in the sun, listening to Lily's laughter and holding Thomas's hand, she knew she had finally made the most profitable investment of her entire life. If Vivian and Thomas's incredible journey moved your heart, please hit that like button and share this video. It helps us bring more gripping, real-life stories to light. What did you think of that shocking corporate betrayal? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you never miss another dramatic update. See you in the next video.